back to Scott's Camera Talk. I'm Scott, and welcome to my channel. We've been talking about buying cameras. So we started by talking about film versus digital. Most people are going to go digital, we realize that, but I didn't want to talk about the idea of film and how the role it played in kind of your decision-making process, and some people may decide to go film. Then we talked about mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras. Mirrorless is kind of the open new technology that's out there, where they're smaller cameras, they're lighter. They tend to be a little more expensive, but you have mirrorless cameras, and you have DSLR, digital single lens reflex, where it looks more like what I'd call the classic old style camera we're used to. Then we talked about formats. We talked about full frame. We talked about full frame versus APS-C versus half frame, and then we even talked about medium format, which is kind of the big professional style format, and making the decision about which format you wanted to go with. And then we talked about all those features that you wanted to talk about as well. What features did we want to think about when we wanted our camera? So people think, okay, what's next? What's next? I said, most people say, well, let me start looking at brands. And I say, actually, my advice at this point is, don't start looking at individual models. Start looking at brands of phones. Brands of cameras. Brands of phones. I was talking about phones about earlier. There are a lot of different brands out there. And the reason why I tell you to think about what brand you're going to pick is that once you make that decision to go with a brand, making a change to another brand later is actually a fairly significant move. It goes to a lot of expense, because you're going to buy lenses and other gear that may be targeted towards that specific brand. And if you go to another brand, all those lenses you bought probably won't work. If I am on Nikon and I've got a bunch of Nikon lenses and I decide I'm going to go to Leica, I'm simply not going to be able to use those Nikon lenses. So I'm going to have to buy an adapter, and they're never going to work really well. So I tell people, before you think about models, think about brand, because virtually all the brands are going to have similar models that you need. Now, Pentax doesn't have mirrorless, but once you find one, if you find like one mirrorless or one DSLR in a model, they're going to have all of them. So they're going to have a bunch. So you want to think about what brand you want to go with. And there are several brands out there. I'm going to go through a few of them, and then I'll tell you the one I chose and why. So probably the big three players in the game are Canon, Nikon, and Sony. Those are the three biggest manufacturers of digital camera these days. Canon has been a producer for a long time. They're probably one of the most well known. Nikon tend to be not much more expensive cameras, but they are more expensive. For professional photographers, they're considered kind of an industry standard, one of the industry standards. So Nikon is an option, and then Sony is kind of what I call the consumer grade, and makes good mirrorless cameras. I don't think they're currently making any DSLR cameras, but they are making mirrorless cameras. So those are probably the big three. And unless you know of a reason to go off of those three, I would honestly probably stick with one of those three. Now let's talk about some of the other ones that exist. There's Fujifilm. They have a bunch of mirrorless and mirrorless cameras. They tend to be very retro. I've had a Fuji for a while. I didn't have great experience with it, to be honest, but Fuji's a very affordable one. Panasonic has a series of cameras out there. Olympus has their OM series, which are very compact and incredibly high performance. There's Leica. Now, Leica builds exceptional cameras. They are considered some of the best cameras in the world, but be aware that with that exceptional quality, you're going to pay an exceptional price. I haven't ever known a beginning photographer to go with a Leica, because not only is the camera expensive, but the lenses are incredibly expensive as well. They're really good lenses, but you're going to pay the price. The other one, and this is the one actually I chose, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, is Pentax Ricoh. Ricoh Pentax has been a manufacturer of cameras for a long period of time. And they were bought by Ricoh a number of years ago, sometime between 1985, 86, and 2024, sometime in that period when I wasn't doing a lot of photography. Ricoh bought Pentax. But Ricoh kind of has kept Pentax as their own kind of brand and their own thing. They don't interfere with it. Pentax is known for really, really strong and durable cameras. I actually had a Pentax in the 1980s that I dropped down the Parthenon accidentally, and the camera continued to work fine now. I don't recommend you do that, but I did drop that camera and it did really well. Now, Pentax does not make a mirrorless camera. They only make DSLRs. They tend to be a little bit more expensive, though you can get into a used one pretty good. Also, Pentax owners tend to be pretty devoted to the brand. Once you've gone Pentax, you'll never go back, is the phrase I use. If you start working with Pentax cameras, you're going to find you really like them, you really like them, that you won't want to move off of another camera. So, Pentax is the brand that I decided to go with. Now, why did I decide to go with Pentax? One is that in the 1980s, I shot Pentax and really, really liked it. It's what I grew up with. And they were solid cameras. They were professional grade. They worked very well. Interestingly, when I went and started looking at the digital Pentax models, which are also still very rugged, they're very popular for people who do photography outdoors, the cameras look the same. My K3, it looked very similar to my K1000, my ME Super. In fact, they just came out with a series of black and white cameras, black and white digital cameras, that look a lot like my K1000, a little bit bigger, but not much. So they look this. So that wasn't the reason why I bought them, is because they look the same. It's because ultimately when I look at them, the controls were almost all the controls I had on my film camera were in the same place on the digital models they had. There's a couple of dials in particular you use a lot for ISO and ASA and the timing, shutter speed. Those were the same. So for me, when I picked up one of these K3s, it just felt comfortable. So now when I end up buying Pentax, and I've been buying Pentax equipment, they tend to be more expensive. They're not Leica expensive, but they are more expensive. They're on the Nikon area. But what you pay for is just rock solid equipment. So start thinking about brands. And what you want to do is talk to people, do some research, look around, and read about each of the cameras or each of the brands and see what they're known for. I have friends that are, like, I have one friend that is, they're Nikon. All they do is buy Nikon. Got another friend that they're an Olympus person. All they do is buy Olympus. So you're going to look at the brands and see what their features are. Brands tend to have stuff they focus on. And so look at a brand, see what they focus on, and see if that's going to meet you. Pentax is all about outdoor photography and being solid. Nikon is all about really, really high quality, but expensive. Fuji is all about making cameras affordable. So is Sony. So think about these cameras, think about what works for you, and decide on your brand. And then we can start talking about models.